Welcome back. This is the Zoom LiveTrak L6, and in this video I will review the key features of this mixer recorder interface. I really like the form factor, sound, quality, and price of this unit. It's really impressive what Zoom has achieved in this convenient device. So it's named L6, giving you the idea that it's 6 channels. But it actually records 10 channels of audio simultaneously, plus a stereo mix over USB or a MicroSD card. And it also does this at 48K Hertz and 32-bit float. Now, the 32-bit float recording and 32-bit recording over USB is one of the headline features of this device, but at the same time might be a detractor for some people depending on your application and needs, but more on that shortly. So I'm going to power this up and you'll see this little light show as it starts up. Because the UI is really clever on this device, we've got encoders that show as you turn up the channels, they'll show the level for each channels. But these encoders also have multiple functions, and those are controlled by these buttons along here. So when it's set to level, you're recording the channel level, but if it's here, then you're controlling the panning for that channel. And likewise, this is the effects send per channel, output to the auxes, and then you've got your EQ settings here where you can adjust your high, mid, and low frequencies, all from the same encoder by pressing these buttons. So there's one encoder for each of these channels, and the channels are organized. So we've got 2 mono channels on combination connectors here that are TRS line level or mic input level with 48 volt phantom power switchable on the first 2 inputs. Now all of the remaining inputs here are 1/4 inch unbalanced, and so they're organized into these stereo pairs. These 2 can be set to mono, meaning you can plug in 2 independent mono channels. They'll share the level controls here, but they'll wind up being recorded to separate files if you record to the MicroSD card. Now these 2 channels also have the feature of having USB return. So if you want to play back from your computer or your digital audio workstation, if you engage this button, then you'll have USB playback here and you can control the level right here. And you have a second 3/4 input from your computer that you can set here and then likewise playing. So if you're using maybe this one for your computer and this one for your DAW, you will not be able to plug in anything here. Nonetheless, in this compact form factor, I think there's a lot of functionality that's really packed in here. So that's the main channels here in the input section, and then we've got the output section here, which includes some sound pads. You can load in 48K Hertz wave files and play them back using these buttons. These can be looped, they can be a one-time one-shot play, or they can be a press and hold to play, giving you a lot of functionality and fun with these. This USB connector is your main USB connection to a computer or other device. Computer meaning Mac, Windows, an iOS device, or an Android device. You've got MIDI over 1/8 inch right here that you can do in and out as well. You may have noticed that there is another USB jack on the side. This one is strictly for power. So I've got it connected to the power adapter, which uses any standard modern USB-C type adapter. You can also connect this to something like a battery bank if you want to power it up that way. The back of this device, which I'll show you in a moment, also allows you to put in 4 AA batteries and power it from batteries. So in this compact package, you've got all of those capabilities. Now, you can also see the other connections. You can put your headphones here. You have master output to your studio speakers here and aux sends here that you could use for monitor speakers or to use to connect to an external effects device of some sort. So if you want to use an external effect, you could send it out aux 1 and then bring it back into maybe channel 6 as a stereo effect. Very flexible, a lot of things you can do with this compact mixer. The other thing that we've got available here is a effects built in, and you can see that we've got hall room delay and echo. And on delay and echo, you've also got a tap tempo function that allows you to set the time to match your music if you want. This controls the level of the delay, this controls the level of the sound pad, this is the master level that controls the output, and this is the monitor level for your headphones. You've also got a 6-segment LED here with a built-in compressor, a master compressor on this thing as well, which actually works quite well. You can store scenes of setups on here. So if we wanted to store this setup, you just press and hold, and that will store that as a scene. And then if you want to have another scenes set up different way, different combinations of all of these things, then you can set up another one here. You can see how that works is that if you make a change, then you can see that it starts to blink. If I just hit that, it will call up my previous setup. Very, very handy compared to other kinds of compact mixers of this size and at this price. There is an inbuilt recording functionality too that will record all of the input channels and the main mix to an SD card, and that's a micro SD card that's loaded in here on the side of the unit. To start recording, you just simply hit this record button like this, and now we've created files for all of these channels, and then you hit it again and then it will stop. You can also record directly into the sound pads by first holding record and then hitting one of the sound pads. And then now we're recording to the sound pad. We hit the pad again to stop recording, and then it saves it. These wind up on the SD card. You can also load multiple sounds onto the SD card and have them available. There is a Zoom LiveTrak L6 app that allows you access to control certain functions on this. It will allow you to choose between if you're in a multi-track mode, which will allow you to record all of the tracks simultaneously, or if you're just into a 2-track mix mode, which will only record the stereo mix to save file space. So you have a choice of that through the app. The app also allows you to make changes to the firmware, and there'll be a little bit more in this video on that later. Now, before I get into more detail, I want to talk about some of the limitations of this mixer. One thing is, because it is 32-bit flowed, Zoom has decided that you don't need gain controls on the channels. So that's definitely saves space and makes the design simpler, but it also means that there's no way to gain stage the mic inputs. Basically, it will do that automatically for you, choosing between one of 2 ranges on the ADD converters for these 2 channels. Now, I've found in practice that works pretty well, but there is some situations where I felt like there's too much gain on shotgun mics when used at close range. There are also no high Z switches if you're going to use this with an electric guitar. So if you're going to use this device with an electric guitar, then you could plug into these channels using a guitar processor of some sort, which works extremely well, or you would need to use a pedal in front of this or a DI box. There is also only one resolution and sample rate. It's fixed at 32-bit float for the bit depth and 48K hertz for the sample rate. Now, 48K hertz is the most popular recording sample rate these days, so that's probably not a big limitation. But if you wanted something at higher resolution, or if you wanted to run at the legacy 44.1, this isn't going to allow you to do that. Not every application is compatible with 32-bit float. Most major DAWs have been updated, and most of the operating systems have, but especially under Windows, you need an application that will run with ASIO drivers. You'll need the custom ASIO driver from Zoom to do that. And there is some special setup that's required on Mac to go into the audio MIDI setup and configure the input and output for this to 32-bit float. I will show you how to do that a bit later. Now for the firmware, mine shipped with firmware version 1.0. The current firmware as of recording this video is 1.10. So you can see if you load the Zoom L6 editor app, it will display the firmware in the lower right of the main screen. So to update the firmware, download the firmware on the Zoom website for the L6. You'll have these options, the L6 firmware, which is at version 1.1. My device is on version 1.0. You'll also find the driver for Windows, which you'll need, and then the editor for Windows or Mac. Also, I'll download the correct files and you'll see that there's some other information here as well. Copy the L6.bin file to the root folder of the MicroSD card. So this looks interesting. It says in this version 1.1 release that they added a function that allows the selection of the audio interface input and output channels setting. This responds to an issue in which some iPad DAW apps would not properly recognize inputs and outputs, and then fixes issues. Other minor issues have been fixed. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but we're going to go ahead and put this in. And in order to put this in, we need to find the bin file, which is this file right here. And I'm going to copy this bin file to the root folder of this SD card. So I've got it in there now, and then there's some way where you hold the play button down while turning it back on that will load that bin file and update the software. And then you power up while holding the play button. Power will flash green during the update and then will flash fast when done. So the mixer is powered off. The instructions say to hold the play button while turning it on, which I'll do. You can see that the power button is blinking. And so it says, I think this means that it's doing the firmware update. Don't turn it off during this process. It also says that if this were to blink red, then it would mean that it's not able to see the SD card. So make sure that you've got that loaded on there. Look at that fast blink. So this fast blink means that it's done with the software upgrade. So at this point, I think I can turn it off and then we'll turn it back on again. Goes through the normal power up and it looks like that is working. After that, just cycle the power and the firmware should be up to date. So this is the back of the Zoom L6, and you'll see there is a battery compartment here. And here you can put in AA batteries. These could be rechargeable or alkaline batteries. There is a way to choose which type of battery that you want to use. If you're in the editor app, there is an option for that. Also on the back, you'll see there is the help link. This is kind of really helpful. If you go to zoom.com help L6, then that will take you to all of the downloads and things for this, and there's a QR code for that as well. You'll also notice that these points here, these little slots, and these slots here are the mounting points for a Eurorack. So there is a two-piece Eurorack rack ear kit that you can buy for this, and it attaches in here. You slot it in here, and then there's a way to screw it and fix it to this right here. And after that point, you'll have a Eurorack setup. They're also coming with that kit is a power adapter for Eurorack that will plug in to this side here. So on the right side, you'll see here is the USB-C power. This is the slot for a MicroSD card right here, and the SD card just pops in and out. You just push on it and it will pop out, and there's a little cover for it. And also here are the instructions to format the SD card. It's basically saying hold down the record button while hitting power, and then once it's powered up, hit play, and that will format the SD card. We're going to turn this around and look at the other side. which basically has just the Kensington lock. One thing additional about the 4 sound pads is that the underlying files need to be in a 32-bit float 48 kHz WAV file. If you drop a file into the app that is some other format, then it will ask if you want to convert to that format. I have also tried loading MP3 files into this, and they're not recognized. So here are some caveats on using 32-bit float like this device. While 32-bit float is becoming more common for recorders, interfaces, and even USB microphones, not all software supports it fully. In Windows, it works best with the custom ACO driver, and on Mac OS, you need to specify 32-bit float in the audio MIDI setup for it to work correctly and be recognized by most common DAWs. So while this does allow for a very high resolution bit depth, you can still overload mic preamps in an analog way with very hot signals. This seems to be a problem when using my Sennheiser MKH416 shotgun mic at close range. Now this is a popular technique for voiceover artists to record with a shotgun mic really close to their face, which gives you a very hot signal. And in my experience with this, that's a little bit too hot. So I needed to use an inline pad to bring that level down a little bit with this. All the other mics and kinds of inputs that I tried seem to work fine with the L6. Now it is also possible to use this and these knobs as a control surface with your digital audio workstation. I have not tried that yet, but that is possible. It is also possible using MIDI in and out here to connect up to external gear, as well as trigger off the sound pad using MIDI notes, and that also can be configured in the editor app. So when using this as an audio interface, the way it works is that it will record the stereo mix to channels 1 and 2. So on your digital audio workstation, it will appear as 12 inputs. The first 2 being the full mix from this device, and then channel 3 is channel 1, and channel 4 is channel 2, which I found a little bit confusing. So you'd want to set up your digital audio workstation and put it in aliases or friendly names for these things. Channel 3 winds up being a stereo pair, and so on this device. And it works the same way for the files that are recorded when you use the inbuilt recorder. You'll get separate files for channels 1 and 2, and then stereo files for the remaining 4 stereo channels, unless you hit the mono button. When you hit the mono button, which is available on these channels, then you'll get separate left and right mono files on these. So if you put in a stereo device and you want to use it as mono, you can hit this mono device. Or you could even put in 2 different input devices, and they'll wind up being panned to the center and also show up as separate devices. In this mode though, they share one level control. So you can't mix them separately, and they'll also pan together when in that mode. But if you put in a stereo keyboard or a stereo guitar processor and hit mono, it will pretty much do what you want. It does give you the flexibility to put in more inputs into this for recording, however. The recordings are also dry on the input channels, and the aux channels can be set to pre or post fader. So if you set them to pre-fader, then that would be how you would use it if you're using it for a monitor speaker for a stage application, or post-fader if you're sending out to an effect for a recording application. Another thing I like about this device is that the effects are what you're most likely to actually need to use in common applications for a mixer: hall, room, spring, along with a delay and an echo. And the delay and the echo are very similar. It's just the echo is more tape-like, where the decays or the feedback will decay over time, more like a tape echo. Each of these has 2 parameters that you can edit in the editor. There is a decay and tone for hall. For the room, you've also got decay and tone. For the spring reverb, you've got a dwell time and tone. For the main delay, you've got time and feedback, and for the echo, you also have time and repeat, which is basically the same thing. So just 2 parameters, but you can edit those 2 parameters in the app, and you can increment through those here with the select button. Very straightforward user interface. So to power this up takes 5 volts over USB-C. A USB-C to A cable is included, and so is an adapter. And this adapter is a simple USB type A adapter. So with that, we've walked through all of the main features of this mixer. Next, I want to show you how it looks in your digital audio workstation. So now I want to show you some things that are related to setting this up as a sound card for your computer. I'm going to demonstrate this in Mac, but I will explain a little bit about how you need to set it up in Windows as well. Now this web page is extremely important if you own this L6 mixer. And it is so important that it's actually printed on the bottom of the mixer. You go to zoomcorp.com/help/L6, and here is all of the resources you need from Zoom to maintain or set up this mixer. You'll see the firmware, which is at version 1.1. I talked about that earlier. If you're on Windows, you will need this driver, 64-bit driver for Windows 10 or Windows 11. And then you can get the L6 editor for Windows or Mac, and you will need that as well to do a lot of the setup on there. I am going to show you that in a minute as well. There's a few important documents, the firmware setup guide, and then these other things, including the manual and this supplementary manual. And I'm going to show you this right now because in the later firmware, they added this, which allows you to set how the sound card inputs and outputs are configured using some tricks when you start it up. And so there's actually 3 modes. You've got the automatic mode, and this automatic mode, it says right on this web page, is for using it with a DAW streaming, calling, etc. And it will kind of tailor the number of I/O automatically depending on your application. And it also says right here to use with an ASIO driver on Windows Select Automatic, and this is the default mode. And so the other modes are the Multitrack mode, which fixes it into 12 in 4 out, or a stereo mix, which fixes it as a 2 in 2 out audio interface. And so these are configured by holding a combination of the USB 1-2 button and one of the sound buttons while you turn it on. So I'm going to demonstrate this right now on the actual mixer. So I'll start by turning it off, and then I need to hold down, I'll put it in automatic mode. So this is the USB 1-2 button, and this is the sound pad button 1. So I'm going to hold those down while turning it on. And as soon as you see it start to do the light show thing, then you'll see this blink. That number 1 sound pad blinked. That means it's now in that mode. That's the automatic and default mode. When it's in that mode, you'll have 3 choices, or it will automatically configure. I'm not exactly sure what that does, but I do believe that is the mode that it's been in before. Now, it will work better or more consistently for digital audio workstations, I think, at least in Mac, if you put it in the multi-track mode, which is option number 2 here. And so to do that, we'll turn it off. Again, I'll hold down the USB 1-2 button, and then I'll also hold down 2 while turning it on. As soon as I start to see the light show, I let go, you'll see this blinking. And now we're in this mode. And you could do the same thing for this, and that will fix it as a 2x2 mixer, meaning you'll only get basically 2 inputs and then the main mix. So now that you've seen that, I want to show you an important step when you're using this with Mac. You will need to go to the audio MIDI setup, and you can search for audio MIDI setup by just going to the search to Spotlight and searching for it. So here's audio MIDI setup, which will list all of your sound devices. You need to choose L6, and then for this to work correctly, then change this to 32-bit float. And you'll see right now that we are in a 4-channel mode, and then that's for the 4-channel output, which is what we want. And we want to set both the inputs and the outputs to 32-bit float. I have been through this, and if I didn't do this, many digital audio workstations would not correctly discover this device, or would discover it but not enumerate all of the inputs. So with it set like this, so just take a look. We're in audio MIDI setup. I've chosen it as the sound card, and then I go into it and choose for the input the 32-bit float option, and for the output I choose the 32-bit float option. If you have it in mode 1 from those buttons I showed you before, there'll be a third choice in here, which is basically as a 2x2 interface. And even so, you would still choose it like this. You'll also see that 48K Hertz is the only choice. So this is one additional step related to this device. This device sounds great and I really like it, but there are some things you need to be aware when you're using 32-bit float. So with it set up like that, I'm going to open an example digital audio workstation. In this case, I'm going to show you this in SoundBridge. If I go into Preferences on SoundBridge, you'll see that the input and the output device appears as Zoom L6. This looks the same in all the other digital audio workstations that I've tried. If I click on the I/O, then it will present that I can choose from all of these mono inputs, stereo inputs, and then the 2 stereo outputs. And like I said, you'll see something similar in your other digital audio workstations. And here is the LiveTrak L6 editor. And on the title here it says LiveTrak L6 editor, but the actual program is called Zoom L6 editor. So the version number for that is here, and then here is the device version number. That is the firmware version. So check right here. Once you've installed this, of course you've got to be connected with USB-C to the top USB-C port. Connecting to the side port is only for power. You need to connect to the top USB-C port for this to actually work correctly. And this has a few different modes of operation, but you'll see that it's just mostly this one page. You've got the date, time, some stats for the sound card, and the remaining recording time. You can see I've got a 256 gigabyte MicroSD card installed, so I've recorded a little bit on here, but I've got a lot of remaining recording time. It interestingly allows you to choose the kind of battery that's in it, between alkaline, nickel, metal hydride, or lithium. And this is for the A batteries. You can put 4 of those in the back of it. I currently haven't used that. I'll just leave it set on alkaline. There's an auto power off that you can choose never or after 10 hours. And then here is another multi-track mode, which sets the multi-track to the multi-track or master only. But this is for recording. The other modes that I was showing you with those button tricks are for how it appears as a USB interface. If you want to only record the stereo mix, then you can choose this. And then when you start to record, you'll get just that. There are additional MIDI control functions, and you can use this thing as a kind of control surface. I haven't used that yet, and so I'm not really sure how that works, but it does allow you to do or change the MIDI channel here between channel 1 and the other channels. So I want to show you these two things are pretty important to the operation of this unit. You can choose the effect parameters here. These are the internal effects. Very concise set of effects and parameters. I really actually like this quite a bit, but you can choose, you can see things like the decay, the tone of the reverb for the hall, the room, and the same thing for the echo. You can tone it down. And then for the delay and for the echo, you can set the delay time right here and the amount of feedback. Usually I like those a little bit less. You can also, of course, do tap tempo on this device in order to set these two parameters. So I just wanted to point that out because it might not be clear that you have any control over those effects, but you can set those here, and that will, once you change them, that will save it onto the device. Another important setting here is the aux send point. For most of these, it's post fader. Post fader is how you typically would set up an aux if you're going to send out to an external effect device, kind of keeping in the idea that one of the main applications for this is modular synths. You might use those to send off to another synthesizer module or effect module, and so they're preset like this. But if you really wanted to use this in a live sound situation and go to a wedge, then typically you would use pre-fader for that type of application, and you can set this by channel pre or post fader. And of course, you've got two aux sends. Despite the fact of how small this mixer is, it really does have pretty good features in this regard. So you've got this send point setting. So you don't necessarily need this if you're not using auxes, but if you do and you understand this, that's a great feature. Now this is where you set up your sound pads. The sound pads are sounds that you trigger. Could be sound effects for live shows that you're doing streaming and you want some clapping or a horn or some funny sound, then you can put those in here. You can also put backing tracks in here, which is what I've done. And I've got on SoundPad 1, I've loaded 2 different options for songs that will play. For each song, you can choose which one will play. You can even trigger it right here. You'll see that triggering it here actually triggers it back on the device. You can see it blinking, meaning that that sound pad is playing. So I'll turn that off over there. You can play that as a one shot, a loop, or hold. If it's on hold, that means it will only play as long as your finger is holding down on it, as you can see like I'm doing right there. So I can hold down and it will play. It's kind of great for a sound effect if you're doing a streaming show. I guess that one there is set for a loop. You can set the level of these things too to adjust them so that they have the right level, and you can play them from a MIDI note. So that's one thing you can do, is set this up, use the MIDI in with the 1/8 inch MIDI in and connect that to an external controller, and then you can trigger these sound pads from that. Now to get sounds in there, you need to go directly to the SD card, and the same thing to get your recordings in and out of the SD card, and that is done with the file transfer mode. Normally when you connect this by USB, you don't see that micro SD card, but if you click file transfer, it asks if you want to go into that file transfer mode. Then once you do, the actual disk or the SSD, the micro SSD, appears as this disk on your computer. And so I'll open that so you can see the file structure here. And you can see that we have the sound pads for each sound pad. Then you have your different WAV files that you can load in there. You could load in a huge list of metronome tracks. You could have backing tracks. You'd have special sound effects, which is kind of the intent of it. Anything you want, but they do need to be in here as WAV files. And if you copy in a WAV file in a format that this thing doesn't understand, it will ask you if you want to convert it to 48 kilohertz and to a 32-bit float. The other thing is under recorder are all of the recordings. You can see here are the recordings that we've made using this device. And for each recording, you have the master mix. You've got channels 1 and 2 mono files and then stereo files. So if you've engaged the mono button on tracks 3 or tracks 4, like this, like I'm showing right now, if you record in this mode, then tracks 3 or 4 will be split to independent left and right mono channels for these WAV files if you have these buttons engaged. You can see that the app is sort of locked up as long as you're in the file transfer mode. It's probably a good idea to go ahead and eject that disk before you leave file transfer mode because it's kind of mounted on the computer. So I'm going to right click on it and do eject, and then we'll click here to get out of the file transfer mode. And with that, we're back to the normal mode. That's everything there is about the Zoom L6 editor. What I like about this is it's pretty obvious, it's very simple. If you get lost, there's a reset all settings down here as well. And so, or if you wanted to return or sell your unit, you can hit reset right here and clear everything out of it. So with that, next I'm going to connect to the device directly and then do a couple of sound examples so that you can hear directly through the device. If I look in this digital audio workstation, I'm using SoundBridge for this example, but most things will work the same. I'm going to hit record. I've set this up where I'm recording the tracks 1 and 2, which is the stereo input or the stereo mix. The stereo mix will be coming off of here. I've got the compressor engaged. That's the bus compressor for that. And then here is going to pick up the mono channel from this. So that's the next one. So if you look in the DAW, it winds up being 1 and 2 for the stereo mix and then channel 3 for this. And that's how I've got this set up here. So now I'm going to start recording. And you can see here, this is the mix, the stereo mix, and then here is my mic coming in on input 1. Now, interestingly, controlling this knob will actually control that stereo mix. So if I turn that down, you'll see that I'm still recording on channel 1, or basically input 3, but mic input 1 here. And if I turn that back up, I can control that stereo mix. So I'm picking up the tri and this at the same time. Now, if I wanted to record to the internal SSD, the same basic thing, all I need to do is hit the record button, and now I'm recording. It's actually created all the files. I'm recording this mix, so I can do both at the same time. That way I can create a backup recording of anything that I'm trying to multi-track over USB, and it will be safely recorded onto this micro SSD on the side. So now we're picking up the main mix from the board and from my mic. I'm going to just basically show you panning. So if I hit pan, then now I can put the panning and put my mic into the left or the right channel. That shows you kind of how the cool interface works on this. If I want to use the effects and send some hall reverb to my voice, then I just turn this up here until I start to hear the hall reverb. I can switch to the room, the spring, the delay. If I tap that slowly and turn that down. So that shows the multifunction nature of all of these encoders. I could do the same thing with the EQ. So if I wanted to add a little brightness to my voice, then you can see I can turn up the high end of that a little bit, or I can add a little more low end to it, so I can do voice of God type of voiceover. And it actually works really well. We can check the frequency or dial in a frequency on the mid-range and boost that like this. I think this is really helpful on guitars or electric guitars, really any kind of instrument. You can boost or cut in that kind of mid-range area and then dial that back. Now you do need to be able to see, if you want to make sure that you've got this centered, you would need to be able to actually, see what you're doing on the encoder. But very cool and interesting user interface on that. You also have the mute buttons on here. Obviously, if I mute that, you're not going to hear me talking, but the same thing is true for all of these. So with that, we've walked through almost all of the features of this board. I'll have a few final comments, and we'll take a little bit more of a look at the construction of this device in the next segment. So these are going to be some of my concluding remarks. What do I think about this unit? And I think it is really well built. Now, I did take the back cover of it off. It's held on with 6 screws that hold the cover on. There's 1 screw in the battery compartment area, and then the back cover just snaps off where you can see in there. Now, I would not suggest that you do that because there's probably nothing much you can do, but I do that just to get an idea of the construction of it. And there's 4 primary boards that are in there, You've got the I/O board, you've got boards under the encoders, you've got boards under the master section, a little board that connects up to the battery compartment area. You'll also see in that B-roll that behind the mic inputs here, the mic jacks, that there is some really nice shielding on there as well. It's good modern construction. Those parts are connected with ribbon cables, and that all looks great. The downside of the LiveTrak L6 might be that it's a little more technical to set it up because of 32-bit float. Also, the fact that it will clip if you really drive a loud mic or a high gain mic, like using a shotgun mic at close range, into these inputs. Since there's no gain knobs on there, I found it necessary to use an inline pad. Now, this is not an expensive thing, and because I've been doing this for years, I have this kind of thing around, which is really just adds a slight resistive load at different gain levels. So if you're using this in a professional situation, you might already have something like this. I did find it necessary in that application because the gain is turned up quite high. I think it's really tuned to use something like the SM7B, which needs a lot of gain. And otherwise, I found it to be a really fun, useful board, and it is so compact. And the fact that it can record 10 channels of audio and the main mix in such a small and inexpensive board, it's really a fantastic capability. I think it sounds great. I'm sure that I will keep this around in my studio and use it this year. And if you want a review of that, I'm not really sure how you use this as a controller for your digital audio workstation. If you're interested in that, leave a comment below. And if you're interested in other digital mixers, check out my recent review of the Yamaha AG06 Mark II. That's linked right here.